Since 1957, when newly independent countries like Ghana and Sudan joined the International Monetary Fund, IMF, Africa has become an integral part of the international lender. The IMF says one of its main goals is to provide diverse financial support to many of struggling economies in Africa, with a long-term goal of ending poverty.
Our biggest role to help Africa is to support Africa to grow. So growth is the best way to beat debt.
But over 5 decades later, African economies are wallowing in unsustainable debts, plunging them into cyclic economic crisis. So what good is the IMF for the continent? Welcome to The Flip Side. When you mention the IMF and its financial programs and interventions, which continent comes to mind as the biggest client? Well, I guess Africa won't be missing from the list, right? African countries have made it a habit to turn regularly to the IMF for resources when hit by global and internal shocks. 48 African countries collectively owe the IMF $42.2 billion. That is nearly 1/3 of the IMF's total outstanding credit, making the African continent a significant borrower of the IMF.
We work very closely with African countries to be a source of liquidity and reserves for them.
But juicy as that may sound, IMF financial support have always come with tighter conditions. Terms like austerity, privatization, liberalization, deregulation, and currency devaluation are often associated with loans from the IMF. Some analysts say these policies and conditions attached with the IMF loans alongside bad economic management by African countries have resulted in making the situation worse than better.
The IMF less emphasis on long-term economic development has been one of the biggest problems of Africa.
African countries may seem to be major clients of IMF, but in reality, they have only been able to access a smaller share of IMF's resources. Over the period from 1952 to 2023, the IMF made a total of 1,529 loan commitments, of which around 40%, that is 608, were to African countries. Over the same period, in volume terms, Africa accessed less than 10% of the IMF's total commitments. So should African countries turn to other alternatives such as BRICS superpowers, China and Russia, who provide loans with lesser conditions?
Let us not hoodwink ourselves into believing that we can get somebody who would leave his own problems and come and solve our own problems. I believe that Africa has enough resources to be able to stand on its own, negotiate on its own, without any backing, without any support from anybody.
At the moment, the IMF wants to open up and give Africa more representation. That's obviously a plan to keep Africa closer, but it does not look like Africa itself has any plan to be independent of such foreign donor support sooner. And that is the flip side.